Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode on how to interrupt with grace. This is something I'm really passionate about because I want everybody to stand up for herself and get that voice out there so that we can come across with our strong presence as well as our strong message and be heard ultimately. Let's talk about what happens when somebody interrupts. So for example, I'm sure we've all been there. You're in a meeting, somebody, you're speaking, you're saying something, and then suddenly somebody says, well, blah, 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 and goes off and takes their ideas. The first time it happens, you're probably a little bit surprised, maybe taken aback. So first of all, give yourself grace that if it happens once or twice and you're taken aback and you don't grab the control back, it's okay. There are plenty of more opportunities to do that. And that's what we're here for today. So first of all, let's imagine what to say and how to say it. Let's think about it that way, because it's really easy at first to go, well, of course, everybody wants to know, what do you say back? But I want to address first how you're coming across. You know that this is important in our presence, but a lot of times we don't think about it. So remember, with your presence, to lean in a little bit. So let's say you're on a Zoom call. If it's in person or in Zoom, but keep in mind that with Zoom, it's also really hard sometimes because everybody's just basically one head sitting there. So a little bit of movement will help and show that either you want to interject or that you're going to counter interrupt. It's a visual cue to help us go, oh, something's happening here. So that's one thing. The other thing is, just in general, have your shoulders back. That's going to make you feel more confident. And so much of this is about mindset and how we feel in our bodies as well. It's that combination so that we can come across in the most powerful way. The other thing is to have your hand raised just a tiny bit potentially when you want to interject, when you're trying to get the control back, not where your hand is way in the camera on Zoom or even in person, you don't want to stick it all the way out, but it's a slight lean forward combined with a little bit of a hand motion that shows, hey, I'm going to talk here. And the other thing is to have a solid voice. You want to make sure that you're not speaking up here, or worse yet, a little bit like this. And maybe if there's hesitancy, halting in your voice, you're definitely not going to come across as confident, and people do not have as much trust for people that don't come across as confident, and as well, the trust can erode. There's a lot of, or the credibility rather, can erode. There's a lot of things here that combine to make it important to come across in a way that somebody goes, that's a leader, I'm going to keep following her, or I'm going to actually listen to what she has to say. But a lot of times, especially as women, the volume in our voice does not come across the way that we think it comes across. So this is always why I'm going to recommend that you record yourself so you can hear how you actually come across, because you're probably speaking softer than you think. And if you have any amount of hesitation, it's going to sound like you're not sure. I was on a conference call just yesterday, and there were 5 of us on the call. I wasn't technically the lead. I was one of the people I was the person rather, that was going to do the work. And the contact, the one that hired me to do the work with these other people, was technically leading the meeting, but it certainly didn't seem that way. So I essentially took over in the gentlest of ways by saying, so-and-so, would you like me to walk through the agenda? Because she was halting and hesitant in her voice and just not taking the control that she needed to take to give this potential client the assuredness that we can handle it, that we're leading the meeting. It's these little nuances that make such a huge difference. And believe me, I'm going to get to the interrupting part, but I want you to know this is the foundation. We have to have these foundational components. Otherwise, when we interrupt, we're just going to look kind of stupid, frankly. The other thing that is important through this, how you say it, the behavioral component, is the eye contact. If you are in person, obviously you want to make eye contact with the person that's interrupting you. If you are on a virtual conference call, Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever application you use, you want to be looking at the webcam, not at yourself. Usually those are in two different places. Now, I know, again, this is basic. This is virtual 101, but it's amazing how still often people are darting around with their eyes. And I know those of you listening, you can't see me, but really darting left and right, up and down, or staring in one place that's at the bottom of the screen. It's going to look like you're looking somewhere else. So that's going to break the connection right there. Okay, that's how to say it. That's that behavioral component of how you're coming across through your voice and your body language. Let's now talk about what to actually say. So somebody's interrupting you, then you may want to give them just a second. It all depends on the context. So that's the also really important thing with this. It's a judgment call, and it might be different in every situation. So please hear me when I say these are some basic things to consider, or a menu of options, I should say, a menu of options for you to consider, to think about what would be relevant and when. One of the things is to use something called an acknowledgement bridge. This is basic customer service training. It's where you acknowledge something that the person says, and then you take it from there and bring it back to your point. So let's say we're talking about some project. Let's say we're talking about the budget, and you were in charge of speaking about that, and then somebody interjects and goes on about why they want, such and such training budget, blah, 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 blah. And then you might say something like this: I love that you are as passionate as I am about budget. And if you give me just a moment here, I'm going to wrap up my section and then we'll turn it back to you. So notice right there, I acknowledged something that, now you've got to be authentic, obviously. I acknowledge something that the person said. I acknowledge, hey, you love training or budget as much as I do. Maybe it's training, whatever it is that they're saying. You could use I love. It could be something like, thank you so much for your passion around this. I love it. What I want to finish saying is blah, 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 blah. So you're interrupting with some positive affirmation. Think about it that way. It's positive acknowledgement. Not like you're saying affirmations in this moment, but positive something. So it could be words like, thank you for those ideas. That is such great input. I'm going to finish mine next, and then we'll turn it over to you and the rest of the people here. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment to finish. Now, it is important to notice, you don't notice what I just did there if you don't mind. That would be in a particular situation where you've got a good relationship with the person. And I mean, it could be, honestly, it could be anytime. But the thing to be aware of is it's that balance of where you're using these kindness or niceties, polite phrases, if you don't mind. That's fine occasionally. Be careful about not doing that too often, because they might say, actually, I do mind. If it's a really strong personality, the person might say, I do mind. Here's what I want to say. So take that with a grain of salt. It all depends on the situation. The other thing that, in that same vein, that I want to caution you about, but also use at certain times, which would be something like, is that okay with you? This so much depends on the person, the personality, how many times they've interrupted you before, what the situation of the meeting is, reading the room, being sensitive about the topic. Maybe it's something where there is a little more sensitivity, or the person's in a potentially little more vulnerable place. I don't know. It just depends always on the context. The other one is simply saying, excuse me a moment. I'm going to finish up here, and then we'll get back to you. If it gets a little more aggressive, perhaps, then you could say, hold on, hold on a second. And also remember, it can come across as if you are miffed or your feathers are ruffled if you look really serious and pissed off when you're saying these things back. So remember to have a lightness to your facial expression. That's really important, really, really important, because we want to have that approachability and likability along with credibility and confidence. We've got to have both of those. So we're always towing the line. And unfortunately, it's a reality of the world that we live in. So unfortunately, we've got to face that and just go, okay, that's the way it is. We've got to move on. Now, if you want to interrupt somebody, then say, I'd like to interject, or I'd like to add, something like that. Or here's what I'd like to add. Here's what I'd like to interject. Or just interject and say the thing that you want to say using that acknowledgement bridge. Love these ideas. I've got one to add, which is blah, 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 blah. Or thank you for your passion around this topic. I've also got a lot of passion around this topic. I'm going to take 30 seconds to put this out there, see what everybody thinks. Lots of different ideas of how you could interrupt someone in a way that shows grace, control, and credibility, as well as confidence. Now, what happens when you have a chronic interrupter? This is a situation where I would definitely recommend one of two things. You either speak to that person privately, you talk to him or her and say, hey, I'm not sure if you even noticed or if you're aware of this. That's always a good way, by the way, to start off with conversations that you perceive to be awkward or there's some conflict potentially there. Hey, I'm not even sure if you're aware of this, but I did want to talk to you about the times that the last couple meetings, or I've noticed a pattern now over the past few meetings that we've been in together, is that you tend to interrupt me. And I'm wondering if you're aware. And then stopping, creating space. In other words, don't talk. See what the person has to say back. The person might go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Or it might be, well, yeah, that's because I have lots of ideas and I want to move them forward. Whatever it is, then you can respond appropriately. The other reason or time when you have a chronic interrupter, what I would recommend that you do is that if you're part of being in charge of the meeting or what have you, part of the thing is to have a no interrupting rule or a parameter around, hey, we want to agree to not interrupt so that we can hear everybody out and then move the conversation forward. Very important to think about that so that then you can have that upfront, you nip it in the bud. You don't have to, then let's say if somebody does interrupt later, you have more ground to stand on because you can say, hey, I don't mean to be rude. I don't want to interrupt you. Yet at the same time, we just talked about interrupting. So let's please keep that in check. I would like to finish what I have to say. Those are two things with the chronic interrupting. The other thing I wanted to say is to look at yourself. If people generally interrupt you, this is where we've got to look at ourselves and go, what am I doing that is causing people to feel that they can interrupt me? A lot of times, if we start a meeting and we don't come across, or when we start speaking, either start speaking, or if we're leading the meeting and we start, either way, when we start speaking, if we come across in a way that doesn't show confidence, it doesn't show control, it doesn't show confidence, which equate to leadership, people are generally going to interrupt you. I'm what I would call one of the most nice, inclusive, kind people. And yet, if somebody isn't moving a conversation forward, I'm going to gently interrupt and ask questions to help us get the thing moving. So I want to say that even I would do that. And there's a lot of people out there that are much harsher than me, or that are going to jump in and interrupt and not have as much patience. So look at yourself, notice, are you coming across with strong projection in your voice? When you start speaking, does it seem like you know what you're talking about through your vocal tone, through your body language? And then are you actually getting to the point? So the content, the actual message that you're saying, are you getting to the point, or are you hesitating? Are you rambling? And by the way, as some of you know, I'm a recovering rambler myself, or as one of my friends the other day said, you're not a recovering rambler, you're recovered. But I think there's always work for all of us to do. But ultimately, make sure that you are getting to the point and you are moving things forward. Because if you're tiptoeing around something, if you're dancing around a topic, if you're not landing the plane and getting to the point, then I can understand why people would interrupt you. So keep that in mind. Let's do a recap. Important to know how you're saying things specifically through your behaviors. Lean in, speak with confidence in your voice, behaviorally show that you are confident through your voice and your body language. Number 2, what to say. Things like, thank you. These are great ideas. And then moving it to your point. That's the technique called the acknowledgement bridge. The chronic interrupters. Number 1, talk to them privately. Number 2, have a ground rule at the beginning of your meetings to not have interrupting. And then the last thing, look at yourself to see how you're coming across. Are you building that credibility and trust through the behavioral component of how you're coming across in your presence, as well as in the words that you're saying? Are you getting to the point and moving meetings along? Looking forward to hearing how this message came across to you. What questions do you have? I want to get into the nitty-gritty. Please feel free to email me, Karen@KarenLaus.com, or you can follow me, of course, on all the places. Would love to hear any input that you have on this one. I get a lot of questions about how do you interrupt people? How do you do it in a way that makes sense, that makes you look good, and also, or mostly doesn't make you look bad. That's of course what most of us are concerned about, but I want to help you to stand out. So moving right along here, have a wonderful rest of your day and keep those questions coming, everybody. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.